Hi, I'm Ruben, but you might know me as Queer Chicano Chisme, and quite frankly, I think too much. So today we're at Dodger Stadium because I'm a huge Dodger fan. So even while I was having a good time at Dodger Stadium, I just couldn't help but thinking about the history of the Chavez Ravine and how the Dodger Stadium came to be. So unfortunately today we're going to talk about that. How the Dodger Stadium came to be and kind of all of the implications that come with that. Okay, so the history of the Chavez Ravine, or Dodger Stadium as we know it today, is a little bit long and messy. But the general, understood start of the fight for the Chavez Ravine begins in the early 1940s, where something like 300 families lived in what is now the Dodger Stadium area, and it was made up of three little villages: La Loma, Palo Verde, and Bishop. The community was really tight knit, and reports say that it was like a big family and people left their doors open, and shared everything, and basically took care of each other's kids. But these people didn't have running water or electricity. They were really running on bare minimum, and so the city of LA saw that as an eyesore. So in 1949, under President Truman, Congress passed the National Housing Act, which is best remembered for aiming to provide a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American. And that sounds really fine and dandy, and if everything went according to plan, things would be different. But just because a law or a act passes doesn't mean that the powers that be are gonna let it happen. So at first the city of LA was yeah, we'll set aside the Chavez Ravine for the housing project. Which okay, good, that sounds good, right? But then you have to remember that there was already 300 families living there, right? So what happened is that essentially the city of LA was evicting everybody from their spots, and was hey, you need to move out. We're gonna build these homes. They're gonna house 10,000 people here, and mostly low income folks, mostly people of color. And they were telling people if you leave, you'll have first pick of the houses once they're built, right? They didn't give them a going away package or anything. It didn't provide an alternative housing situation. Essentially the options were get the fuck out, or we'll get you out of here. And so a lot of families did listen, and they did leave, right? Relocating to Echo Park, to Boyle Heights, to South Central, to Southeast LA. However, there was about 25 families who did not move. They were distrustful of the city and really didn't believe they had their best interests in mind. Plus, they didn't want to leave their community that they've built, right, with other people, with multiple families. And their instincts were right, because they moved a lot of families during the late 1940s and the early 1950s to supposedly build this great housing unit for low income families. But construction didn't start on the project, right? And so more and more people were realizing that maybe something was up. And that's when it was basically announced that the Brooklyn Dodgers would be moving to LA. In October 7th, 1957, the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, Walter O'Malley, signed a contract with the city of Los Angeles, which basically traded a 9-acre stadium site, which they had previously purchased in LA, and basically traded it for the 350-acre site near downtown that we now know as Dodger Stadium. Right? This is after years of Walter O'Malley basically trying to buy a bigger stadium in Brooklyn, but all the plans for that didn't fall through. So essentially the name of the proposed housing units was Elysian PARK Heights, right? And unfortunately that is nothing but a street name now, because it never came to be. See, it took so long to begin even really building Elysian PARK Heights, right, that by the time that they wanted to build it, the national attitude had changed around affordable housing units and basically basic human rights, right? We entered a period of conservatism brought on by Mccarthyism. So Mccarthyism was this campaign, this huge propaganda thing that was promoted by Senator Joseph McCarthy between 1950 and 1954. And it was basically like trying to scare people away from like communism, right? So because the US was barely like trying to like recover from like World War II and trying to really find a national identity, they saw basically like communism is foreign and bad, and like basically trying to get people to really buy into capitalism, right? And so this really began in like Hollywood, right? So there was a lot of folks who were labeled communists and couldn't find work, right? And everything that had related to communism was seen as bad, right? Like we're thinking about like affordable healthcare, we're thinking about like affordable housing, things that are like for the public good were labeled as like bad because they were anti-capitalist and thus un-American. And a lot of the times, like, there didn't have to be, like, a foundation for these accusations. They just needed to be made in order for people's lives to be ruined. There was this hesitance to, like, label yourself a communist or to associate with people who were communists because that meant that you basically wouldn't be able to have a job in the U.S., right? You would be basically labeled a social pariah. And you were, like, distrusted. You were thought to be like a spy for like, or like a Soviet agent, which is like fucking ridiculous. Some popular figures that were like victims of McCarthyism were folks like Lucille Ball, Leonard Bernstein, W.E.B. Du Bois, Allen Ginsberg, Albert Einstein, Langston Hughes. Just basically anyone who wanted to do any fucking good in the world was labeled like a communist, and like thus like couldn't find work, or like it was hard for them to find work, and they were put out of the public's good favor. And so this didn't only affect like celebrities. That's just an example. Like the most important part of like McCarthyism is that it really disallowed from public good to occur, right? Like for public good to be promoted. So the National Housing Act of 1949, basically like there was like a big backlash against that. It was like, no, public housing is like a communist idea. Like folks are supposed to work hard to be able to afford like a good house or whatever. And everything kind of came to a fever pitch, no pun intended, on the June 3rd, 1958 ballot that had Proposition B, wherein LA citizens were able to vote on whether or not they wanted the Dodgers to take over the Chavez Ravine, right? Or like to continue with the housing plans to build Elysian PARK Heights, which was what the housing unit was originally planned to be called. And so with this proposition came a lot of celebrity endorsements for Dodger Stadium. Folks like Groucho Marx and Debbie Reynolds and even fucking Ronald Reagan would go on TV and be like, vote yes on Prop B, or else you're a baseball hater, right? And like in many cases, like hating baseball was like being anti-American, right? Because baseball is known as like America's favorite pastime or whatever. And so there wasn't only that, there was also like the LA Times, right? Which had like a major stake in like the development of downtown LA, right? So they would put out like hit pieces on the folks living in Chavez Ravine. They would be like, oh, they live in a junkyard and shit like that, right? Like not verbatim, but essentially implying that, right? So the LA Times also shaped public opinion about whether or not the Dodgers should exist in the Chavez Ravine and whether or not these Mexican American families deserve to exist there as well. And eventually Prop B passed, but not by a lot. It was like 20,000 votes that separated the Dodgers from coming to LA or not. Yet, despite the vote, there was about 25 families who refused to move from Chavez Ravine. Like, this was their hometown. This is all they knew. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not like the city had, like, an alternative plan for them. It was like, get out of your fucking home and figure it the fuck out. Like, it wasn't like, get out of your home and we got these units over here waiting for you and your children. And so these folks refused to move out. And on May 8, 1959, who a lot of Mexican Americans now know as like Black Friday, sheriff deputies basically dragged out families out of their homes and basically forced them into the streets, right? And it was broadcast on like national television. It was kind of like to shame like poor people of color. Because another thing we have to remember is that like segregation was still very much a thing at the time. As a matter of fact, about a decade earlier, the Los Angeles Housing Authority completed 3 public housing projects: Avalon Gardens, Hacienda Village, and Pueblo del Rio. And when these were initially built, it was announced that they would be segregated by race: one white, one black, and one Hispanic. It wasn't until a lot of folks held a protest vigil in Hacienda Village that the housing authorities were like, okay, fuck it, we'll mix them. And so that's just kind of like to paint the fact that like racism was still like overt. Not that it isn't now, but like even more so then, right? And that racism really shaped LA. When I say that racism helped shape Los Angeles, I don't mean to blame it solely on the Dodger Stadium. Of course, there was things like redlining, the railroads, the dumping of metals, the construction of warehouses. Those things are to blame, right? But this very unique thing happened with the development of two sites, which were the Dodger Stadium and the Music Center in downtown LA. Both were meant to attract more white people to the downtown area and create like a more illustrious, like metropolitan area, because LA, specifically like the downtown area, was kind of lackluster at the time, and they really wanted to compete with sites like New York and Chicago and San Francisco. And by they, I mean folks who were really invested in the development of LA as a city. So, home builders, the Los Angeles Times, the Chamber of Commerce, all kind of got together and created this organization, which was non-ironically called CASH, the Citizens Against Socialist Housing. And together with Norris Polson, who was elected mayor in 1953 under a campaign that promised to stop un-American spending, which definitely included the 1949 Housing Act. So all these figures got together and essentially were like League of Evil building in LA, right? And their first big attacks were in the downtown area. And so they didn't want to develop like public housing in the metropolitan area, because that essentially would drive down the prices of their homes and their investments. So like the Dodger Stadium was meant to attract middle class white folks. The music center was supposed to attract like elite, like rich white people. That and the fact that like the Dodger Stadium and the music center were easily accessible through the newly built highways really made it so that it was elite by design, right? Like we have to remember that the car wasn't like a thing that every single family had back in the day, right? Nowadays, LA is seen as like car city, and that has to do a lot with like why our public transportation sucks, right? And that's because they didn't want poor people, specifically people of color, to be entering every single part of LA, right? They needed us to stay in our designated areas. And so thinking of the Dodger Stadium in these terms, it's very easy to see how a stadium built on the top of a giant hill with a vast parking structure like is very, very inaccessible unless you have a car, right? And so this is something that developers had in mind when they were building this in the late 1950s. Like who had access to the automobile, what class were they, what race were they, right? Because to the day, like baseball remains a very segregated sport. And that's kind of where the, I guess, positive impact of the Dodgers in LA like shows itself. Dodgers have one of the most diverse fan bases and rosters of any other team in the league. But even discussing whatever positive impact the Dodgers have had on the city of Los Angeles seems rather incomplete. See, the gentrification and the expulsion of people of color from LA hasn't stopped. And it's also not enough to just talk about the Dodgers. As a matter of fact, we have teams like the Rams who are moving into Inglewood who have also already had an impact on the citizens of that city. So many of them, mostly people of color, have been already pushed out of their homes because they've been unable to afford the rising rent. And I bring up the Rams because they've had a odd parallel to the Dodgers. See, the Dodgers were world champions in 1955, right? And that helped promote and galvanize people to accept them moving to LA, in a way that the Rams making it to the Super Bowl in 2019 is also being pushed as like, wow, we can bring this like huge team that it will make LA proud. But needless to say that like most sports coming into a big city always seems to have a really bad repercussion for the marginalized people of that city. See, speaking about the Dodgers and gentrification isn't only relevant because of the Rams, but also because of the 2028 Olympics that are set to come to LA. The anticipation for the 2028 Olympics have already driven up rent in a lot of spaces surrounding the Coliseum, and many folks, particularly those of color, have already been priced out of their homes. Because see, when folks promote these large sports events as an economic good, what they really mean is that they're economically good for corporations, not marginalized people, especially those who are low income, and even more specifically, those who are of color. And even then, y'all are gonna hate me because I'm gonna have to complicate this more. See, it talks about gentrification and how sports affect it, especially in regards to how Chicanos, Chicanexes talk about the Chavez Ravine, always seem to leave out something very important: settler colonialism. There's this ongoing trend of folks saying like gentrification is the new colonialism, and it's like that kind of forgets that colonialism never ended. So it conflates these two terms that have different meanings that at first glance might seem like they run into each other, but in reality they don't. First of all, a lot of folks who are being pushed out because of gentrification might themselves be settlers. So even though gentrification implies that a marginalized group with less resources is being pushed out of their homes by a dominant group with more resources, both parties at play here might be settlers, right? So both of them might be responsible for taking up land that was that of indigenous peoples before them. Whereas colonialism doesn't only mean like the taking of land, right? But the elimination of a place's original people, as well as the exploitation of their resources. So we still see that even in the US, indigenous people were driven off their lands and into reservations in a lot of cases. And as it pertains to LA, their land was taken pretty much altogether. The original people of Los Angeles were mostly the Tongva people, and unfortunately they're not federally recognized because, again, Spanish colonialism just made it so that they don't have any treaties to go back on. So while they're recognized by the state, their lack of recognition by the federal government means they don't have a technical claim to land other than, like thousands of years prior to colonization. And after all this, where does this leave us? Are you a horrible person for enjoying baseball and supporting the Dodgers? No. Well, I mean, I think I'm a horrible person for enjoying all these things, but that's just because I think too much again. No, like, I'm not saying, like, you have to stop enjoying sports and like, you can't enjoy baseball anymore. Because at the end of the day, like, if I stop enjoying baseball today, if you stop doing it, like, it's not gonna all of a sudden trigger something in the Dodgers to be like, oh my God, like, we are, like, the perpetrators of gentrification and settler colonialism. Like, they're not gonna, like, wake up, right? They are a corporation. Like, you cannot rely on corporations to do the right thing. There's nothing I can do about the Dodgers and their part in settler colonialism, but there's something that I can do on my part. Like, I can, learn about the history of the people whose land I'm on, right? Even if I was born in LA, right? Tongva folks were here before us. So how can I do to help them, right? Would it be financial? Would it be front lines protesting? Would it be boosting them? Like, how can I help indigenous people attain, like, land sovereignty, right? And then when it comes to gentrification, like, what can you do to fight back against that, right? In a lot of cases, there is something we can do, right? Whether it's joining already existing movements or funding them, or if you're a gentrifier, like, maybe not fucking gentrifying, right? And it's not only about, like, being in the front lines, right? There's so much work when it comes to, like, indigenous sovereignty and anti-gentrification work that consists of, like, this unsung work of, like, activism, which includes things like childcare and healing spaces and, art and so much other, like, work and organizing that we just take for granted that we can start uplifting and partaking in, right? And that's kind of what I want us to take away, right? Like, what can we as, like, non-corporations, as, like, not evil entities, hopefully, unless some of y'all are evil entities, which, like, that's your business. What can we do to, like, not perpetuate the evils that corporations do? Is it fighting settler colonialism? Is it fighting gentrification? Is it doing all these things at once? Maybe, right? We all have our different capacities, and we also have a responsibility to engage the entertainment we partake in, because that's kind of a part of being conscious, right? Or like trying to be conscious, or just trying to be not a shitty person. And hopefully it doesn't suck the fun out of everything. Okay? Don't forget about fun. Thank you for watching this. If you liked and learned from me today, you can like, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you want to keep seeing content from me, you can become a patron at patreon.com/queerchicanochisme. None of my work would be possible without my patrons. So I want to give a special shout out to them right now, especially Daniel V, Juan Carlos E, Chris N, Chris K, Julianne S, and Marty P, as well as Juno. All of y'all have been tremendous supporters, and I thank every one of my patrons. So currently I have enough supporters to put out like one video a month. So for real, if you would like to see way more content, like I can really use the patronage. All right? Okay, I'll see you next time.